When we think about slavery, the first images that come to mind are usually chains, fields, and forced labor. But the foundation of slavery was not just labor, it was control. For enslaved Black women, that control was maintained through carefully designed systems of violence and torture. These punishments were not random bursts of cruelty. They were deliberate strategies aimed at breaking down not just bodies, but minds, communities, and even generations to come. The torture of women in slavery carried a gendered weight. Women were not only workers in the fields and in households, they were also mothers, caregivers, and the bearers of future generations. Slaveholders knew this, and they weaponized it. By targeting women, they could exert power not only over individuals, but over entire families and communities. To break a woman's spirit was to strike at the heart of the enslaved community itself. Torture served multiple purposes. On one level, it was a means of punishment, to correct perceived disobedience or resistance. On another, it was a form of terror, a warning to others about what awaited anyone who defied the rules of slavery. And perhaps most disturbingly, it was also a way to assert dominance, to remind women that they were considered property, stripped of legal rights and bodily autonomy. One of the most chilling aspects of this system was its public nature. Punishments were often carried out in front of others, forcing women to endure humiliation alongside physical pain. A woman whipped in front of her children, or stripped and beaten before a crowd, experienced a double punishment: the agony of her body and the shattering of her dignity. The spectacle of her suffering sent ripples of fear through everyone watching. This practice of public torture was especially devastating for mothers. Slaveholders understood the emotional bond between mother and child, and they exploited it cruelly. Women were sometimes punished in front of their children, as a way to silence resistance and discourage defiance in the next generation. The message was clear: if you resist, not only will you suffer, but those you love will be forced to witness it. In this way, pain became a tool for breaking the spirit of entire families. The purpose of torture also extended into the economic logic of slavery. A slaveholder's wealth was tied directly to the productivity of enslaved labor. Therefore, punishments were designed not necessarily to kill, but to incapacitate just enough to terrify. Enslaved women were expected to survive their punishments, scarred but still functional, so that they could return to the fields, kitchens, or nurseries and continue to generate wealth for their oppressors. In this twisted economy, suffering itself was part of the business model, but beyond control and economics, torture had another purpose: dehumanization. By subjecting women to inhuman conditions, by stripping them of clothing, privacy, and dignity, enslavers reinforced the idea that they were not people, but objects. Every scar on a woman's back, every forced punishment, was a branding of sorts, a mark of ownership as much as a reminder of suffering. Writings from formerly enslaved women confirm the deep psychological scars left by this system. Harriet Jacobs, in her memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, described not only the fear of physical punishment, but the constant weight of humiliation and powerlessness. For women, the torture was often entwined with sexual violence, another brutal method of asserting control. Their bodies were battlegrounds upon which slavery enforced its dominance. Still, it's important to recognize that the purpose of torture was not always fulfilled. Slaveholders sought to break women down, but many resisted internally. Some held on to their sense of self despite the pain. Some found ways to pass down songs, prayers, or whispered lessons to their children, ensuring that even in the face of unimaginable brutality, a thread of humanity survived. So, when we speak of the purpose of torture and slavery, especially for women, we're speaking of a weapon of control, an economic tool, a method of dehumanization, and a psychological war. It was systemic, it was deliberate, and it was devastating. but it was not absolute. For every act meant to erase a woman's humanity, there was endurance that carried her spirit forward. While the whip left visible scars on the body, the most enduring wounds of slavery were often invisible. Psychological warfare was at the heart of the system, and for enslaved Black women, it was as devastating as any physical punishment. Torture wasn't always about blood or broken bones. Sometimes it was about the calculated destruction of the mind and spirit. Overseers and slaveholders understood that if they could control how women thought of themselves, how they saw their families, and how they envisioned their futures, then resistance would become much harder. And so, psychological cruelty became an everyday weapon. One of the most powerful tools of this warfare was fear. The unpredictability of punishment created a constant state of dread. Women never knew when an ordinary day might turn into a nightmare. Something as small as slowing down in the fields, speaking out of turn, or being accused of disrespect could result in brutal punishment. This unpredictability kept women in a heightened state of anxiety. The fear of what might happen often felt worse than the punishment itself. Another form of psychological torture was humiliation. Punishments were often carried out in ways designed not only to hurt but to shame. Women were stripped of clothing in front of others, their dignity torn away along with their privacy. For a society that deeply valued modesty, this stripping down was more than physical exposure. It was the deliberate destruction of a woman's self-respect. The shame lingered long after the physical wounds healed. Mothers faced unique forms of psychological warfare. Enslavers knew that a mother's greatest vulnerability was her children. Women lived under the constant threat that their children could be sold away at any time, and this uncertainty created unbearable emotional torment. Even when no physical torture was taking place, the looming threat of family separation was a silent form of agony. Slaveholders used this fear deliberately, holding it over women's heads to enforce obedience. A simple reminder, remember what could happen to your child, was often enough to silence resistance. The use of other people's suffering as a psychological weapon was also common. Women were forced to watch the torture of loved ones, friends, or even their own children. This created a cruel dilemma. Do you resist and risk your loved one's pain, or do you remain silent and live with the guilt? Either way, the torment was inescapable. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and sensory manipulation added another layer to this warfare. Women might be forced to stay awake for days, their minds unraveling under exhaustion. Some were locked in dark spaces, deprived of light and sound, until their sense of time and reality began to blur. Others were kept under constant noise or bright light, unable to rest or think clearly. These methods attacked the mind itself, wearing down resistance until even strong spirits began to falter. The psychological warfare also extended into spiritual life. Many enslaved women held on to faith, prayer, and traditional practices as sources of strength. Slaveholders understood this too, and often twisted or denied these spiritual outlets. Women might be punished for praying or singing traditional songs. At times, Christianity was manipulated and weaponized, with distorted teachings used to justify slavery and obedience. For women seeking hope and identity through faith, this distortion was another cruel layer of control. Perhaps the most devastating form of psychological warfare was internalized dehumanization. When a woman is constantly told she is property, when every law, custom, and practice reinforces that message, it becomes harder to hold on to one's sense of self. Many women fought against this internal erosion of identity, clinging to memories, stories, or cultural traditions. But the pressure was relentless, designed to make them forget who they were and accept the roles forced upon them. And yet, despite all of this, enslaved women developed remarkable forms of psychological resistance. Some found ways to secretly teach their children pride and resilience. Others used songs, stories, and coded language to preserve their heritage. Even small acts, a whispered prayer, a hidden gathering, a shared lullaby, became defiant victories in the war against psychological domination. Psychological warfare was intended to erase identity, dignity, and hope. But women found ways to hold on to all three, often in quiet, unseen acts of resistance. These moments of defiance remind us that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit can adapt, resist, and survive. For enslaved Black women, the body was not just a vessel of labor. It became the primary site where slavery enforced its violence, discipline, and control. Every scar, every forced labor, every invasion of privacy turned the female body into a battleground, one where the system of slavery sought to conquer, and where women fought, in ways big and small, to endure. Women's bodies were targeted differently from men's because of gendered expectations. Enslaved men were punished primarily for their labor and resistance. Women, however, were punished not only as workers, but also as mothers, caregivers, and sexualized objects within the twisted logic of slavery. This meant that their bodies bore the weight of overlapping forms of violence. The whip was the most visible weapon of domination. Overseers used it not just to inflict pain, but to leave marks that testified to their power. Women were often stripped before being whipped, a deliberate humiliation designed to amplify the suffering. The pain was terrible, but the exposure, the forced vulnerability of being unclothed before men, women, and children was equally scarring. The body became both canvas and message. You are owned. You can be marked at will, but torture extended far beyond the whip. Women were subjected to temperature extremes, forced into freezing cold or sweltering heat, sometimes buried in snow or sand. Their bodies were tested not to the point of death, but to the edge of endurance. Others were restrained and left exposed to insects, creating days and nights of torment as bites, stings, and infections multiplied. These forms of biological torture turned the natural world itself into an enemy. Chemicals added another dimension. Substances like lime or lye were applied to the skin, especially to sensitive areas, causing burns and infections. The slow, ongoing pain that followed was a reminder of punishment long after the act itself. Scars left by chemicals were permanent, branding women not only physically but socially, as visible markers of torture followed them everywhere. Sexual violence was perhaps the most profound way in which enslaved women's bodies were turned into battlegrounds. They were vulnerable to the advances of slaveholders, overseers, and even other enslaved men who were sometimes coerced into these acts. Sexual abuse was not just individual cruelty, but a systemic tool of control. It reinforced women's lack of autonomy and turned reproduction itself into a weapon, since children born from such abuse automatically became the property of the slaveholder. A woman's womb was conscripted into the economy of slavery. Against her will, pregnancy did not protect women from punishment. In fact, pregnant women were sometimes forced to lie face down in pits dug to protect the fetus while their backs were whipped. This gruesome method demonstrated the dual logic of slavery: punish the woman, but preserve her value as a reproducer of future labor. Her body was at once disposable and indispensable, yet even in this brutal reality, women found ways to resist. Some intentionally limited pregnancies through knowledge of herbal remedies, an act of defiance against the system that sought to control their wombs. Others fought back by running away or by finding solidarity with other women who shared their pain and resilience. Their bodies may have been claimed, but their spirits found ways to reclaim some measure of agency. Medical torture added another layer of cruelty. Some women were subjected to experimental procedures or denied proper treatment, leaving them to suffer infections and long-term health problems. For many, the betrayal of medical care, the very institution meant to heal, created lasting trauma and fear. The body as a battleground was not only about suffering, though, it was also about survival. Women carried scars, but they also carried children, songs, and traditions. Every day they continued to work, cook, nurture, and endure was a day they defied a system designed to erase them. Their bodies bore the evidence of slavery's cruelty, but also the proof of its failure to completely destroy their humanity. In remembering the bodies of enslaved women as battlegrounds, we see both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of resilience. They were forced to endure pain unimaginable to us today, but through endurance, they ensured that their descendants could one day carry forward their story, their strength, and their dignity. Slavery was not sustained by labor alone. It was sustained by fear. And to manufacture that fear, slaveholders and overseers relied on tools of terror, instruments specifically designed to cause pain, humiliation, and lasting control. For enslaved Black women, these tools were not abstract symbols. They were weapons wielded against their bodies and spirits, leaving scars that carried meaning far beyond the physical wound. The whip was the most infamous of these tools. Made of leather, often with knots or metal tips, it tore into the flesh with every strike. Women's backs bore the maps of this violence, scars that told stories of punishment and survival. Yet the whip was more than a weapon of pain, it was a performance. Overseers often used it in public, forcing women to endure not just agony but humiliation before their peers, children, and communities. The crack of the whip was a language of terror, spoken loudly enough to silence defiance, but the whip was only one piece of the arsenal. Shackles and chains bound women at the wrists, ankles, or neck, reducing them to objects of transport. Iron collars with spikes were sometimes used, making movement painful and sleep nearly impossible. These devices were not only physically punishing, but psychologically crushing. To be chained like an animal was to be told, every waking moment, that you were considered less than human. The stocks and pillories, wooden frames that locked the body into place, were another common punishment. Women were immobilized for hours or days, exposed to the elements, insects, and the gaze of others. For mothers, this torture was especially cruel. To be locked away from one's children, unable to comfort or protect them, turned the stocks into an instrument of both physical and emotional torment. Other tools of terror came in the form of muzzles and gags. These metal contraptions were strapped onto the head and mouth, preventing women from speaking, eating comfortably, or even expressing emotion. Slaveholders used them to silence women who spoke out, resisted commands, or even dared to sing. The gag was not just about silencing noise, it was about silencing identity, expression, and dignity. Imagine the anguish of a woman unable to speak to her child, forced into silence by cold iron pressed against her skin. The creativity of cruelty extended even further. Some punishments involved the use of animals, trained dogs released upon women, their bites tearing flesh and instilling lifelong terror. Others involved environmental tools, being buried in freezing snow or scorching sand, restrained under the burning sun, or left to insects that gnawed at skin. These tools turned the natural world into accomplices of slavery's violence. Chemical substances were also weaponized. Caustic agents like lime and lye were applied to sensitive areas of the body, burning through skin and leaving permanent scars. These punishments blurred the line between tool and torture, transforming everyday materials into instruments of prolonged suffering. Yet, perhaps the most insidious tools of terror were those linked to women's roles as mothers and reproducers. The auction block itself was a weapon, a stage where women were stripped, examined, and sold like cattle. This process was humiliating by design, reducing a woman's identity to her physical traits and reproductive potential. The auction block was not just commerce, it was psychological warfare. Medical instruments, too, were co-opted into this arsenal. Women were subjected to experimental procedures without anesthesia, their bodies treated as sites of practice rather than patients deserving of care. In the hands of enslavers, tools of healing became tools of torture, but even as these tools sought to destroy, women found ways to resist. Shackled hands still braided their children's hair. Gagged mouths still whispered prayers in stolen moments. Scarred backs still carried baskets of food to feed communities. Each act of endurance was a quiet defiance against the tools meant to break them. The tools of terror remind us that slavery was not only an economic system, but a technological one. Instruments were invented, refined, and passed down as part of the knowledge of domination. These tools were designed with precision, not only to punish, but to preserve life just enough to extract more labor. This reveals the cold calculation behind the cruelty. Torture was not chaos, but policy, and yet, the very fact that women survived these tools is a testament to resilience. For every iron collar, there was a woman who found a way to lift her head. For every whip, there was a back that healed enough to continue resisting in body or spirit. For every shackle, there was a determination to pass on dignity to the next generation. The tools of terror sought to define enslaved women as powerless. But in surviving them, women transformed these instruments into symbols of both cruelty and courage. Their scars did not erase their humanity, they testified to it. No system of violence sustains itself without people to carry it out, and others to look away. In slavery, torture was not only the act of a single cruel overseer, but part of a wider system of enforcers and bystanders who made such cruelty possible. For enslaved Black women, this meant their suffering was amplified not only by the individuals who inflicted direct harm, but also by the silent approval of those who stood by. Overseers were often the immediate enforcers of punishment. Paid to maximize productivity, they carried whips, chains, and the authority to use them at will. For enslaved women, overseers represented constant danger. Any sign of slowing down in the fields, answering back, or protecting a child could provoke violence. Overseers were trained not just in discipline, but in dehumanization. They learned to view women not as mothers or daughters, but as hands, units of labor to be corrected like broken tools. The brutality of overseers was sometimes framed as necessary by slaveholders, who claimed harsh discipline kept order. But in reality, the system rewarded cruelty. Overseers who pushed enslaved people hardest were often praised, while those who showed leniency were replaced. This meant women lived under constant threat, their bodies subject to the whims of men, incentivized to punish rather than protect. Slaveholders themselves were not distant from this violence. Many personally inflicted punishments, seeing it as their right of ownership. For enslaved women, the master's involvement often combined physical violence with sexual abuse, adding layers of humiliation and danger. The master's authority extended not only to labor, but to women's very bodies, leaving them vulnerable in ways that defied escape. But enforcers were not always white. In some cases, enslaved men were coerced into roles of authority over others. Tasked with punishing women, they faced impossible choices: obey and inflict suffering, or resist and risk their own lives. This fractured communities, leaving scars of mistrust. For women, to be punished by someone who shared their oppression added a cruel dimension to their suffering, as it blurred the line between enemy and victim. Beyond the enforcers, there were the bystanders, the neighbors, visitors, and family members of slaveholders who witnessed or heard of punishments and did nothing. Some attended public whippings as if they were community events, normalizing the spectacle of pain. Children of slaveholders grew up watching enslaved women beaten, chained, and humiliated, learning to see cruelty as ordinary. The silence of bystanders was itself a form of violence, reinforcing the system by allowing it to continue unchecked. Even institutions acted as bystanders. Laws were written to protect slaveholders, not the enslaved. Courts refused to recognize the testimonies of Black women, no matter how brutal their suffering. Churches often remained silent or, worse, justified slavery with distorted scripture. This institutional bystanding meant that enslaved women had nowhere to turn for justice or relief. The entire society became complicit in their suffering, yet it's important to note that not all bystanders were passive. In rare but powerful moments, some resisted. Enslaved women themselves sometimes stepped in to shield others, even if it meant absorbing punishment. Fellow enslaved men occasionally defied orders to whip women, though the cost was often deadly. And in the wider world, abolitionists, writers, and escaped slaves began speaking out, breaking the silence that allowed torture to thrive. But within the day-to-day reality of plantations, those voices were few compared to the overwhelming silence. For enslaved women, the role of enforcers and bystanders reinforced the sense of isolation. The whip came from one man's hand, but the permission for it came from the community, the law, and the church. Every strike carried the weight of an entire society that had agreed their suffering was acceptable. This collective complicity magnified the cruelty, turning individual acts of violence into systemic oppression. Still, women found ways to resist even in the presence of enforcers. Some refused to scream during punishment, denying their tormentors the satisfaction of a reaction. Others prayed aloud, asserting dignity in the face of humiliation. These acts, though small, challenged the authority of overseers and reminded communities that women's humanity could not be erased. The role of bystanders and enforcers reminds us that slavery's violence was not the product of isolated bad men. It was a system in which ordinary people, through action or silence, upheld extraordinary cruelty. For enslaved women, this meant there was rarely a safe space, rarely a sympathetic witness. Yet their endurance under such conditions highlights not only the brutality of the system, but also the strength required to survive it. For enslaved Black women, survival under the weight of constant violence was not passive. Every day lived was an act of defiance, every small choice a form of resistance. While the system of slavery sought to break them through torture, humiliation, and fear, women developed strategies to endure, to protect their families, and to preserve their humanity. Survival itself became resistance. One of the most powerful acts of resistance was the preservation of cultural identity. Women passed down songs, stories, and traditions, weaving threads of African heritage into the fabric of enslaved communities. These songs were not only lullabies or work chants, they were coded messages of resilience. A mother singing to her child in the quarters was resisting the dehumanization that said she was nothing but property. By teaching language, rhythm, and belief, she was building continuity where slaveholders tried to create erasure. Spiritual practices were another form of resistance. Enslaved women often blended Christianity with African spiritual traditions, creating a faith that spoke to their suffering and hope. Prayer meetings in the woods, sometimes called hush harbors, became sacred spaces where women could cry out, mourn, and dream of freedom. These gatherings were dangerous. Discovery could bring punishment, but they offered women the strength to endure another day. Faith became a shield against despair, a reminder that the soul remained untouchable even when the body was in chains. Resistance also took practical, everyday forms. Women found ways to slow the pace of labor, hiding small acts of sabotage in plain sight. A basket carried too slowly, a tool intentionally misplaced, a task done imperfectly. Each was a way of asserting control in a world that tried to strip them of agency. Slaveholders often dismissed women as weak or inefficient, not realizing that these so-called weaknesses were sometimes deliberate acts of quiet rebellion. Some resistance was more direct. Women sometimes ran away, either alone or with their children, braving the dangers of dogs, patrols, and starvation. Escape was not always successful, but even the attempt was an act of radical defiance. Stories of women who sought freedom, like Harriet Tubman, who returned repeatedly to rescue others, became symbols of courage that inspired those still in bondage. Tubman's very existence was proof that women could outwit the system designed to destroy them. Even within the brutal confines of plantations, women resisted by protecting one another. When one was punished, others might sing to drown out her cries, offering solidarity in the face of humiliation. Older women often mentored younger ones, teaching them how to navigate dangers, avoid overseers' wrath, or survive sexual exploitation. The solidarity was vital. In a world designed to isolate and control, women built networks of care that became lifelines of survival. Motherhood itself became resistance. Slaveholders saw women's ability to bear children as a way to increase wealth, treating reproduction as property expansion. But enslaved women redefined motherhood as an act of defiance. By loving their children fiercely, protecting them from punishment when possible, and teaching them dignity, women undermined the system that tried to turn family into commodity. Even when families were torn apart by sale, the memory of a mother's love could not be sold or erased. Women also used their voices to resist through storytelling and testimony. Figures like Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, revealed to the world the specific torments endured by women, including sexual violence that had long been hidden. By putting her pain into words, Jacobs not only survived, but weaponized her survival against the institution of slavery. Her story became a rallying cry for abolition and a refusal to let silence be complicit. It's important to understand that resistance did not always mean overthrowing the system in dramatic ways. Often, it meant choosing to survive another day. It meant enduring the whip without losing the will to live. It meant finding moments of joy and laughter and dance and shared meals, even when everything around screamed despair. These moments of humanity were victories in themselves, reminders that enslaved women were not broken by the tools of terror. Slavery sought to erase identity, but resistance carved it back. Survival was not simply about enduring pain. It was about preserving selfhood against the forces of annihilation. Women turned scars into symbols of strength, silence into prayer, and despair into defiance. And resisting in both large and small ways, they left a legacy that continues to inspire generations. Enslaved women remind us that resistance is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is in the quiet hum of a mother rocking her child. Sometimes it is in the whispered prayer after punishment. Sometimes it is in the simple refusal to let cruelty define the soul. Their survival was not just endurance. It was a powerful declaration that they were more than what slavery tried to make them. The end of slavery did not mean the end of its wounds. For enslaved Black women, the tools of torture and the weight of humiliation left scars that stretched far beyond emancipation. The legacy of pain carried through generations, shaping lives long after the chains were broken. To understand this legacy is to recognize that slavery was not simply a historical event, but a trauma that continues to echo. The physical scars were undeniable. Whip marks, burns, and injuries from shackles or collars remained on women's bodies as living reminders of what they endured. These scars were not just private burdens, but visible evidence that could not be erased. They spoke louder than words, testifying to the cruelty women had survived. Yet for many, these marks also carried shame. In a society eager to forget the realities of slavery, women bore on their skin the stories the nation wanted to silence, but the deeper legacy was psychological. Generations of women were forced to endure torture while being told they were less than human. This systematic dehumanization created patterns of trauma, fear of authority, anxiety over family separation, and struggles with self-worth. For mothers, the loss of children sold away created grief that never healed. That grief, passed down through memory and silence, became part of the collective pain of Black families in America. The gendered nature of slavery left particular wounds. Women who had been subjected to sexual violence carried both the physical and emotional weight of that abuse. The silence around these experiences meant many could never speak of their suffering, even to their children. The legacy of sexual exploitation did not end with emancipation. It transformed into stereotypes that continue to affect Black women today. Myths of hypersexuality, rooted in slavery's justifications for abuse, still echo in harmful cultural narratives. Economically, the legacy of women's torture lived on in systemic inequality. Enslaved women had built wealth for others through their labor and even their reproduction, but emancipation left them with nothing. They entered freedom with no land, no compensation, and often no protection. The scars of slavery translated into cycles of poverty and vulnerability that persisted for generations. In this way, the pain of the past became the foundation of ongoing inequality. Yet, the legacy of pain was not only destructive, it was also transformative. The survival of enslaved women created a lineage of resilience. Their songs became the foundation of spirituals, gospel, and eventually the rhythms of Black music that shaped culture worldwide. Their testimonies fueled abolition, civil rights, and feminist movements, ensuring their voices echoed far beyond the quarters and fields where they were once silenced. The endurance of women like Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman gave future generations a model of resistance and courage. Their stories proved that even in the darkest conditions, women could speak truth, fight for freedom, and demand recognition of their humanity. The legacy of pain, therefore, was also a legacy of strength, a paradox where suffering bred both trauma and defiance dot in many Black families today. Stories of slavery survive in fragments, whispers about ancestors who were slaves, or the memory of a grandmother's grandmother born in bondage. These fragments are themselves a legacy, a reminder that the past is never fully past. For women, these inherited memories carry both weight and pride. Weight because of the pain endured. Pride because survival itself was victory. Even in public history, the legacy of enslaved women has too often been silenced. For decades, narratives of slavery focused on men's labor or political debates, leaving women suffering in the shadows. But in recent years, historians, artists, and filmmakers have begun to reclaim these stories. By naming the tools of terror and acknowledging the specific torture women faced, society begins to honor not only their pain, but their humanity. The legacy of pain is also a call to responsibility. To remember enslaved women truthfully is to resist the temptation of sanitized history. Their scars, their silence, their resilience, all demand that we confront slavery not as distant, but as a living influence on today's inequalities. From the prison system to economic disparities to cultural stereotypes, echoes of that pain remain. To ignore them is to repeat the complicity of the bystanders who once stood silent, yet the most profound part of this legacy is hope. Enslaved women endured the unimaginable, and still they found ways to nurture, to resist, and to dream. Their survival planted seeds of freedom that grew into movements for justice. Their resilience shaped not only their descendants, but the very idea of America as a nation still struggling toward its promise of liberty. Legacy of pain reminds us of the cruelty that must never be repeated, but it also reminds us of the resilience that can never be erased. Enslaved women were more than victims of torture. They were builders of memory, carriers of culture, and guardians of hope. To tell their story is to honor their suffering, but also to recognize the extraordinary strength that turned survival into a triumph over dehumanization. As we close, let us remember that the stories of enslaved women are not just chapters of a painful past, but testimonies of strength that continue to shape the present. Their voices, their resilience, and their survival deserve to be honored, not forgotten. If this history has deepened your understanding, I invite you to share this video so that these truths can reach more people. The memory of these women lives on, and through remembrance, we ensure that their dignity, their courage, and their legacy of survival continue to inspire future generations.